Slavery, the dehumanizing system that allows for people to be classified as property, is rumored to have been abolished 150 years ago in most countries. Despite a lack of awareness in our modern society, bonded and forced labor, trafficking, and exploitation continue to be a prevalent issue in today's world. Many investigations have reported up to 30 million cases in relation to slavery, 60,000 of which have occurred within the United States. Due to the common white male perceptions that African Americans were uncivilized, slavery was considered socially acceptable as late as the 19th century. In present day, slavery has no longer been socially acceptable and is subsequently hidden from society. 19th century slavery can be compared to and contrasted with modern day slavery. Economic greed was and continues to be the driving force behind slavery. The contrast between modern day versus 19th century slavery is that before the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, slavery was socially acceptable, whereas today it is not. An additional comparison between this day and age and 19th century slavery is the working conditions faced by slaves and the means by which slave owners forced victims to work. The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, is an autobiography written through the eyes of a pre-Civil War era slave known as Frederick Douglass. Douglass is well known for being one of the most influential African Americans from the antebellum era as a writer of his narrative, which takes the reader through his experiences as a slave. The experiences described through Douglass's narrative can be used to compare and contrast modern-day slavery. Modern-day slavery is seen in different forms that is once described in history. The most commonly seen types of slavery are forced labor, bonded labor, descent-based slavery, trafficking, child slavery, and early enforced marriages. In 19th century, slavery was used as a way for wealthy landowners to make large profit with cheap or free labor. As described in Douglass's narrative, slaves would work long hours in the fields and harvesting crop. Today, there are about 18.5 to 22.5 million bondage slaves in the world, making bonded labor the most expansive form of slavery. Bonded labor is a person's labor used for the repayment of debt or other obligations. It is seen as a result of poverty, absence of alternative credit sources, and the lack of justice and rule of law, a wide gap between wealth and poverty, high levels of unemployment, and corruption. India is home to an abundant amount of bonded labor cases. A few years ago, a man named Haresh explained his story of how he took a loan of $110 from a local landlord so that he could marry his wife. Without a sense of how much debt he owed the landlord, Haresh set himself and his family up to work 14 hours or more every day for 20 years with barely enough water or food to survive. Unfortunately, this case of slavery displays that despite the developments which have occurred in our world, individuals are still willing to support an attempt to discriminate and enslave other individuals. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, in order to declare that all persons held as slaves within rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. Before this historical benchmark occurred, slavery was seen as socially acceptable. In the 19th century, by the law of the land, by the voice of the people, and by the terms of the slave code, slaves were only a piece of property, a beast of burden, a chattel personal, as said in Douglass's narrative. The United States used to be separated into the North and the South being pro-slavery. It was in these states where cruelty thrived and competition between slave owners was more than abundant. Due to the fact that slavery was legal and one of the most driving forces in the economy with regards to the production of crops, it was socially acceptable and seen through the public eye. Today, thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery is illegal and no longer socially acceptable. Unfortunately, slavery is still present, holding roughly 30 million people victim to abuse and forced labor. Labor trafficking is a more common form of modern-day slavery in the U.S. and worldwide. An estimated 14.2 million people are in forced labor. Victims are often U.S. citizens, foreign nationals, men, women, and children. Although slavery is technically illegal, it still thrives and is a large contributor to the economy and world today. Throughout history, African Americans were enslaved to raise the South-based labor-intensive crops, which included sugar, rice, tobacco, and cotton. Slaves were often working at dawn to go work in the fields by the sound of a car horn. Those who didn't wake were severely whipped and beaten. Slave owners showed no mercy to African Americans, and any sign of disrespect or hesitation to do as he was told would result in whipping or other form of physical abuse. Modern-day slavery cases have described similar treatment and working conditions for slaves. In 2014, there was a nation-shocking case where 50 workers were enslaved in a household factory in Jakarta, Indonesia. These workers were forced to work with dangerous chemicals from 5 a.m. to midnight with no pay, and were given one shirt and a pair of pants. The hostages were forced to sleep on the floor of a wet, windowless room, guarded by armed men, and were beaten at random for no reason. It can be analyzed that slavery has not changed much with regards to working conditions faced and how they are forced to work. Slavery has existed since before written history in all cultures and societies. It used to be recognized and legal, but now has been outlawed in all countries. Slavery is commonly seen through forced labor, bonded labor, trafficking, child slavery, and early and forced marriage. The economy continues to be a large factor behind slavery, and before the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, slavery was socially acceptable, whereas today it is not. Working conditions faced by slaves and how they are forced to work have stayed relatively the same since the 19th century. Despite the prohibition of slavery, millions of people are still held victim to the cruel intentions of others today. Although our world has gone through many generations and technological advancements, many things such as slavery remain the same.